In the dying light of a desert evening, where the saloon doors creaked like old bones and the wind smelled of whiskey, sweat, and secrets, something unimaginable waited just beyond the lantern glow. Cowboys drank to forget. Men gambled away futures they never intended to live. But down a crooked alley behind the saloon, where no lawman ever wandered, something far more sinister festered. It was there, between rotting barrels and broken crates, that he found her. A girl no older than 16, chained like an animal, her dress torn, her voice long stolen. And in that breathless second, as his eyes locked with hers, the West stopped spinning. He was no preacher, no hero, just a drifter named Callahan with nothing but dust in his pockets and a scar down his back that told more truth than most men ever dared to say. He'd come to town for a saddle repair and a bottle to forget the war. But what he found behind that saloon changed everything. The girl didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply looked at him, eyes wide, hollow, and pleading without a sound. And in that silence, he made a decision that would cost him everything, except his soul. The men inside who kept her cage were the kind who smiled when they hurt you. Wolves in waistcoats, protected by the same sheriff who played poker with the judge. Callahan could have turned away, could have walked on like 1,000 others did. But something ancient stirred in him. Maybe it was the memory of his little sister, long buried beneath cottonwood trees. Maybe it was the way the girl's wrists bled against the iron. Or maybe it was just the last flicker of decency left in a man who had lost too much to let evil win one more time. He didn't ask questions. He didn't make threats. He simply drew his knife and stepped forward, the metal gleaming under the moonlight like a promise. What came next would ignite a fire that the town of Hollow Bend would never forget, where bullets, blood, and truth would collide in the name of one silent girl. A girl no one would claim, except the man who refused to leave without her. This is not just a tale of violence or vengeance. It's a story about the cost of conscience in a world that sold it cheap. About a moment where one man's refusal to look away became the only justice a godless town would ever know. The air behind the saloon was thicker than gun smoke, steeped in the stench of old liquor and something fouler, something human. Callahan stood there, frozen, not by fear but by the overwhelming weight of injustice. The girl's eyes, dark and unblinking, stared through him. No tears, no voice, just the hollow expression of someone who had waited too long to be rescued. Her hands were bound tight, wrists swollen and raw. Chains clinked softly when she moved, the sound more haunting than any scream. He didn't ask her name. He only said, "I'm not leaving without you." And she, for the first time, blinked. Inside, laughter roared, the kind of laugh that only came from men who thought they owned the world, or at least this piece of it. Callahan slipped his knife from his boot sheath, the same blade he'd carried since the war. He remembered what it meant to fight for something you couldn't name. He approached her slowly, his voice low. "I'm gonna cut you loose. Might get ugly after that." She didn't flinch, didn't nod, just waited. As the blade bit into the rusted links, a cold wind swept through the alley like the land itself was holding its breath. He knew what came next wouldn't be quiet. The men who'd done this weren't just drunk cowards. They were owners of gambling tables, of women, of fear. And in towns like Hollow Bend, that meant they owned the law too. The sheriff would be on their side. So would the judge, the barkeep, maybe even the preacher. Callahan wasn't just stealing a girl. He was declaring war. But he didn't care. Somewhere between the whiskey and the scars, he'd buried a part of himself that still believed in justice. Tonight, that part clawed its way out like a rattler from the sand. He walked her to his horse slowly, shielding her body with his own. She stumbled but didn't cry out. Her silence screamed louder than any gunshot. When he lifted her into the saddle, his hands shook, not from fear, but from rage. This wasn't just rescue. This was redemption. The kind of man didn't ask for, but took when fate finally gave him the chance to make something right. She clung to the saddle horn, fingers barely strong enough to hold. He mounted behind her, pulled his hat low, and whispered, "Hold on." They didn't make it far before the first shot rang out. It splintered the night, echoing across the dry hills. Callahan spun the horse into the brush, bullets cutting through sage and dust like angry wasps. He didn't look back. Couldn't. He had one mission now: get her out alive. Every hoofbeat was a prayer. Every breath was defiance. And as the lights of Hollow Bend faded behind them, Callahan knew one thing for certain. The girl wasn't the only one who'd been in chains. Until this night, so had he. They rode hard until the moon was nothing but a memory, and the sky bled with the first pale hint of dawn. Callahan's horse, an old roan named Jonah, breathed heavy beneath them, but didn't slow. The girl leaned forward, weak from hunger and exposure, but she never asked him to stop. That silence between them, heavy, sharp, was filled with things too broken to speak. When they finally reached the tree line, Callahan dismounted, helped her down gently, and laid his coat on the cold ground. "Rest here," he said softly. She curled into the earth like it remembered her. He started a small fire, careful not to let the smoke rise too high. He had no illusions. The men from Hollow Bend would come. Maybe by morning, maybe by nightfall, but they'd come. The kind of men who didn't let go of what they believed was theirs. Callahan chewed on dry jerky, then tore the rest and placed it in her hand. She hesitated, eyes darting. "Ain't poisoned," he muttered. She took it. It's slow. That one moment, her trust felt bigger than any victory he'd had with a rifle in his hands. "By noon," she spoke. Just one word. "Mara." Her voice was brittle, a whisper stretched too thin. Callahan nodded. "I'm Callahan." No need for last names. The West didn't care about them. What mattered was the weight behind a name. And now hers, Mara, was branded into his memory like a flame to rawhide. She told him nothing more. He didn't ask. What had been done to her didn't need retelling. It lived in her eyes, in the way she flinched at the sound of cracking twigs, in the way her fingers stayed curled, even at rest. That night, the stars stretched across the sky like open wounds. Callahan sat with his rifle balanced on his knees, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. He thought about all the wrongs he'd let pass. Women slapped, boys beaten, men buried without a voice. And now, beside him, sat the consequence of looking away too long. Mara, wrapped in his blanket, drifted into a sleep that looked more like survival than peace. He didn't sleep. Couldn't. Not while she breathed beside him like a fragile piece of the world he was suddenly willing to die for. The next day, hoofbeats. Distant, but unmistakable. Callahan stood, rifle raised. Mara jolted awake, panic in her bones. He stepped in front of her, planting his boots deep in the soil. Whoever came over that ridge would see a man ready to burn the whole world before he gave her back. He'd crossed a line, yes, but it was the right one. And in a land built on greed and silence, sometimes the only law that mattered was the one a man carved with his own hands. The riders crested the hill in a cloud of dust, 4 of them, armed, cruel-eyed, and grinning like hounds on a scent. At their center rode Hank Delroy, the saloon's owner and the man who'd chained Mara like a forgotten animal. He tipped his hat like he was greeting an old friend. "Mighty bold of you, Callahan," he said, voice slick as oil. "That girl's mine by contract." Callahan didn't move. His rifle stayed aimed, heart steady. "She's no man's property," he replied, his voice calm but coiled. "Not anymore." For a moment, only the wind dared to speak. Delroy dismounted slowly, hands raised to show false peace. "Now, I ain't here to start a war," he lied, stepping forward. "But you know how things are done out here. Ain't no judge between here and Carson gonna back you. You got no deed. No claim. Just trouble." Callahan narrowed his eyes. "I don't need a deed to protect what's right." Delroy's smile cracked. He glanced at the others. One reached for his gun. Too slow. Callahan fired once. The man dropped, face first in the dust. The silence afterward was louder than the gunshot. The others didn't move. They weren't ready for this kind of fight, the kind not born of greed or bloodlust, but conviction. Callahan stepped forward, gun still raised. "This ends now. You ride back to Hollow Bend and tell the rest. She's free. You come again, you die here." Delroy's smirk died in his throat. His men looked at each other, suddenly unsure. It was one thing to fight a thief. It was another to stand against a man with nothing left to lose but his honor. Slowly, reluctantly, Delroy mounted his horse. "This ain't over," he spat. "No," Callahan said. "It's just beginning." They rode off, leaving behind the body of the man Callahan had dropped. Mara hadn't moved. She stared at the dust trail, her body rigid, her fingers digging into the earth. Callahan turned to her slowly. "They won't stop," she whispered, her voice low. "I know," he said, "but I will." It wasn't bravado. It wasn't even comfort. It was a promise made between two people who had nothing left to offer but grit and truth. That night, she didn't sleep alone. She curled close to the fire, close to him, no longer shaking at every sound. The first peace she'd known in who knows how long. By morning, they moved again. Not far, just deeper into the hills, where the pines thickened and the creeks ran clear. Callahan knew they needed time, not just to hide, but to build. If they ran forever, they'd always be prey. But if they stood their ground, laid claim not with law, but with labor, maybe, just maybe, they could make something no one could take. He showed her how to trap small game, how to boil water with stone and flame. And slowly, Mara began to move with more purpose. Not healed, but alive. And in the West, sometimes that was enough. Weeks passed. The valley where they'd made camp turned green with early spring, and with every sunrise, Mara's silence softened. She began humming low songs in a language Callahan didn't know. He never asked, just listened. The sounds threaded through the trees like something older than pain. One morning, while fetching water, she caught her reflection in the stream and lingered. She stared long, as if trying to recognize herself again. Callahan watched from a distance, not wanting to disturb the moment. Healing, he'd learned, had its own speed, and no man had the right to rush it. Callahan found logs from a fallen cedar and began building a cabin. Not big, just enough for shelter and safety. Mara helped. Her hands, once too weak to lift even a cup, now gripped hammers and rope with quiet strength. They didn't speak much, but each glance, each gesture, said enough. Two people learning to breathe again in a world that once tried to suffocate them. Sometimes in the evening, she would sit beside him and ask questions. "Why did you stay? Why do you trust me?" Each time, he answered the same way. "Because someone should have, long before me." But the world they tried to leave behind wasn't done with them. News came by way of a fur trapper. Word of a bounty posted on Callahan's name, and on Mara's too. Wanted for theft, for murder, for the abduction of a minor. The paper carried their faces, crudely drawn, but clear enough. $500 each, dead or alive. The West had made its choice. It wouldn't admit its sins. It would rather erase those who reminded it of them. Callahan held the paper in his hand as the fire consumed it. "They'll come," he said. Mara nodded. "Let them." That night, thunder rolled in, not from the sky, but from the ridge above, the unmistakable rhythm of horses. Callahan and Mara stood outside their half-built cabin, side by side, eyes fixed on the horizon. He handed her a rifle. She took it without hesitation. She wasn't the same girl he found in chains. She was something sharper now, something rooted. She didn't flinch when the first shot rang out. She dropped to her knee, aimed, and returned fire like she'd been born to it. In that moment, the girl who'd once been silent became the voice of vengeance itself. They fought through the night, two against many. The air burned with powder and fury, the flames of their fire casting ghostly figures in every direction. But they held, not because they were stronger, but because they had nothing left to give but everything. By morning, the hillside was silent. The attackers had either fled or fallen. Callahan was bleeding, but standing. Mara, ash streaked across her face, knelt beside him with steady hands. She said nothing, didn't need to. In the eyes of the law, they were fugitives. But in the eyes of the land, they were free. And that was a freedom no bounty could ever buy. The days that followed were quiet, but not still. Mara attended to Callahan's wounds with hands that had once trembled, but now moved with the calm resolve of someone who had learned to face pain without flinching. She cleaned the gash on his side with creek water and wrapped it in strips of linen torn from the shirt he wore the night he freed her. He winced, but never pulled away. "You're lucky," she muttered. "Barely missed your lung." He smirked, weak but steady. Luck had nothing to do with it. Just didn't want to die before the roof was finished. They rebuilt the cabin stronger this time. Logs packed tighter, door reinforced with iron hinges salvaged from an old mining post. They dug a root cellar, planted corn, and even fenced off a patch of earth for goats if they ever managed to trade for any. Each stroke of the axe, Each stone laid into the foundation was a declaration. We are not running anymore. Mara grew taller in her silence, her body lean and sun-warmed, her spirit unfolding like something that had survived the frost. Callahan watched her from the shade sometimes, wondering how someone who had suffered so much could hold so much dignity. One evening, a lone rider approached. An older man, weathered, unarmed, wearing a hat older than most towns. He introduced himself as Elijah, a preacher of sorts who wandered from valley to valley, baptizing cattlemen and burying outlaws alike. He'd heard of Callahan and Mara from a passing trader. Instead of offering judgment, he offered bread and tobacco. Word is you saved a girl from hell, he said softly. But the world only calls you killers. Callahan shrugged. The world's been wrong before. Elijah stayed the night, listening more than speaking, and left at dawn with a simple blessing. Let your fire outlive your fear. Winter came fast. Snow blanketed the valley in silence, muting every sound but the crack of wood under boot. Mara and Callahan took turns keeping the fire going, their breath fogging in the cold air, their hands chapped but warm in each other's presence. She laughed more now, quiet, fleeting moments, but real. One night, as they sat wrapped in a wool blanket, Mara asked, "Do you miss who you were before?" Callahan stared at the flames. "No," he said after a pause. "I think I was waiting my whole life for a reason to become someone else." That winter, a letter arrived, tucked inside the pocket of a trader who didn't ask questions. It came from a woman named Mercy Dawson, someone who had once known Mara's family. She wrote of a new settlement being built out west, beyond the reach of bounty posters and crooked judges. A place where names weren't chained to mistakes, and a girl could start over with her head held high. Callahan read it aloud, slowly, watching Mara's face as each word painted the possibility of something better. She didn't smile. Instead, she simply reached for his hand, not out of need, but choice. And sometimes, that was louder than any yes. Spring crept in like a secret, soft green shoots pushing through the frostbitten ground, birds returning to the skies as if they too had survived something brutal. Mara began keeping a journal, scribbling notes with a charred stick on scraps of canvas. She wrote about the land, about the wind, about the boy she'd once been promised to, and the girl she never got to be. Callahan didn't read it. He never asked. He only made sure she always had something to write with. "Some stories ain't meant for men like me," he said, "but they still deserve to be told." One morning, she showed him a sketch she'd drawn in the dirt. 2 horses saddled, side by side, heading west. "Do you believe in places that don't exist yet?" she asked. He looked at the drawing for a long time before answering. "Not until I met you." That afternoon, they packed what little they had, dried meat, blankets, a small sack of coins. Callahan folded the bounty notice one last time and buried it beneath a cedar tree. "Let the worms have it," he said. Then he mounted Jonah, reached down, and pulled Mara up behind him. She didn't hold on out of fear anymore, just love. As they rode westward, the terrain shifted, hills giving way to flatlands, rivers carving paths like veins across the heart of the earth. They slept under stars, bathed in creeks, and shared stories around makeshift fires. Mara spoke more freely now, asking about Callahan's past, the battles he fought, the people he lost. He answered honestly, never dressing his pain in heroism. "I wasn't a good man," he said once, "but I'm trying to be a better one. Not for redemption, just for you." She leaned her head on his back, and in that moment, he felt more forgiven than any priest ever could have offered. One night, they arrived at a bluff overlooking a wide valley. Below, a small settlement glimmered with lantern light and promise. Mara breathed deep, then looked at him. "This place, it's not perfect," she said. "No," he replied, "but it ain't Hollow Bend." They rode down at sunrise, passing a sign that read Red Mesa, "All welcome who come in peace." The words weren't a guarantee, but they were a beginning. And for people who had lived too long in the shadows, beginnings were the rarest kind of freedom. In Red Mesa, no one asked about their past. No one looked twice when Callahan tipped his hat, or when Mara walked the market with her chin high. They bought lumber. They rented land. They started over, not as ghosts of the West, but as builders of something new. And as the first rains of spring fell across their roof, The girl who had once been found in chains laid her head on a man's chest, not out of survival, but out of choice. And that, in the end, was the most powerful kind of escape the West ever allowed. Red Mesa was unlike any town they had known. There were no saloons with locked backrooms, no judges fat with bribes, no shadows that whispered of chained girls or silent justice. It was a place still growing, rough around the edges but honest. People nodded at Callahan with quiet respect and smiled at Mara like she was already part of the land. They built their home near the edge of town, where the grass met the high desert. It was small but solid, a place with a roof that didn't leak, a door that didn't lock out fear, but welcomed peace. Mara planted sunflowers out front, said she liked how they always turned toward the light, no matter how heavy the sky. Callahan spent his days working with his hands, repairing wagons, helping neighbors raise fences, teaching boys how to shoot straight without hate in their hearts. He no longer carried his rifle on his back, but it still rested by the door. Not out of paranoia, but memory. Some parts of the West were too old to die fast, but they could be tamed if a man was patient, and if a woman was brave enough to plant beauty in broken soil. One afternoon, the local schoolmistress asked Mara to speak to the older girls. She hesitated, unsure if her voice had value outside of pain. But Callahan took her hand and said, "You ain't just a survivor, Mara. You're a teacher of strength." So she went, heart pounding, and spoke, not about the chains, not about the blood, but about silence, about how it can be a prison or a weapon, depending on how you carry it. When she finished, the girls sat in awe. One cried, one hugged her, and Mara, for the first time, realized her story wasn't her shame. It was her shield. That night, as the rain tapped gently on the tin roof, she sat beside Callahan and asked, "Do you ever wonder if the people we were still watching us?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Maybe they are, but they ain't waiting for us to fail. They're waiting to see if we make it worth it." She smiled at that, not a broken smile, a whole one, a smile made not from what she'd lost, but from what she'd dared to reclaim. They held each other without urgency, without fear, just two souls breathing in a world that had tried, and failed, to crush them. In the weeks that followed, Callahan started writing too. Not much, just short lines in a notebook Mara gave him. He wrote about firelight, about forgiveness, about the night he saw a girl in chains and realized that he, too, had been shackled all along, by regret, by silence, by the belief that he had nothing left to offer. And every time he wrote her name, he wrote it slowly, not because he had to remember it, but because he wanted to feel every letter again, like a prayer, like a promise, like the start of something sacred. It was late summer when the past came knocking again, not with gunfire this time, but with a dusty rider carrying a government letter. The bounty had been dropped, the charges dismissed. The name Callahan no longer bore the brand of outlaw, and Mara was listed only as a person of interest rescued from unlawful captivity. No apologies, no recognition, just silence from the system that had once hunted them. Callahan read the letter and laughed, sharp, dry. Took him long enough to realize we weren't the criminals. Mara, standing behind him, said softly, "We already knew." But the arrival of the letter stirred something in Red Mesa. People began asking questions about who they'd been, about what they'd done. And for the first time, Callahan and Mara didn't shy away. They spoke plainly, not to shock but to teach, to remind this new land that even outlaws can carry honor, and even the wrongfully chained can lead with grace. The blacksmith's wife, once skeptical, now invited Mara to quilting circles. The sheriff, a quiet man with a limp, asked Callahan to train the young deputies. And slowly, the past became not a threat, but a tool for building something better. The cabin became more than a home. It became a gathering place. A place where people came to talk about things most towns buried. The men brought stories of sons who ran, of wars they never understood. The women brought scars they didn't always show, but always carried. And Mara listened, not as a victim, but as a guide. She showed them what survival looked like when it turned into purpose. Callahan made coffee. He fixed boots. He listened too, because he knew sometimes the greatest healing didn't come from speaking, but from being present. One night, they hosted a dinner under the stars. Tables made of wagon planks, lanterns swinging in the breeze. Children ran barefoot through the tall grass, and laughter, real and full, filled the valley. Mara stood at the center, her face lit by fire, her hair braided with feathers gifted by an old Apache woman who said she saw the warrior in her eyes. Callahan stood beside her, watching not just the scene, but the journey. From chains in the dark to this. A woman free, a man reborn, and a town changed because two broken people refused to stay broken. And as the night deepened, and the stars took their place in the black sky like witnesses to something holy, Mara leaned in and whispered, "You didn't save me, Callahan. You showed me I could save myself." He didn't answer, just pulled her close and whispered back, "That's all I ever wanted." And with that, the story that began behind a saloon, full of blood, silence, and pain, had transformed into something the West rarely saw, a love born not from need, but from truth and the courage to never turn away. As the years rolled on, Red Mesa became a dot on maps travelers actually looked for, not for gold or cattle or trade, but for something rarer, peace. The town grew, and with it, so did the legend of the quiet man and the girl once found in chains. But to Callahan and Mara, there was nothing legendary about it. Their days were filled with work, real, backbreaking, honest work. Callahan built furniture, his fingers now more familiar with carving than with the grip of a trigger. Mara ran a reading circle for girls who'd been told all their lives to stay small. Here, they were taught to dream wide. Sometimes, wagons rolled in from places like Hollow Bend or Crow Ridge, towns that still believed fear kept order. Some came to see if the stories were true. Others came just to cause trouble. But no matter who came, they all left with the same memory. A woman who stood straight and steady with fire in her voice, and a man who didn't need to raise a gun to make people sit up and listen. The power in their story wasn't in how it began, but in how they chose to live every chapter after. With dignity, with defiance, and with hope. One morning, Mara found a bundle of wildflowers on their porch. No note, no name, just a quiet offering from someone who had listened, who had learned, and who wanted to say, "Thank you." She kept those flowers on the table for a week, changing the water each day, as if tending to them was a way of tending to her own roots. Callahan watched her and smiled. She had grown into herself completely, not as someone's property, not as someone's wound, but as someone whole, someone who could walk into any room and carry the room's weight without lowering her eyes. On the anniversary of the night she was freed, Mara lit a single candle and placed it in the window. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. That candle was for the girl who had once lived in the dark, for the thousands like her still waiting in silence, and for the man who didn't walk away. Callahan stood beside her, his hand resting on the small of her back, his eyes on the flame. "You think she'd recognize you now?" he asked. Mara answered, "I hope she'd be proud." And deep down, he knew she would be. Their love was never loud. It didn't need to be. It was in the daily rituals, the way Mara ran her hand along the wood grain of his chairs, the way Callahan always poured her tea before his own. It was in the looks shared across rooms, in the way they spoke each other's names like prayers. The town called it legendary. They just called it life. And through that simple, quiet life, they changed a place. Not with war, not with fire, but with something far more enduring in the West. The stubborn, sacred choice to love without chains. Years later, when Callahan was an old man and Mara's hair had turned silver like the moon on Riverwater, a young journalist came from the city to write about them. He sat across from them with a notebook, eager to capture the legend, the heroics, the gunfire and grit. But what he found instead was something he didn't expect: tenderness. Mara served him stew. Callahan whittled quietly while he asked his questions. And when the boy finally asked, what was the turning point? The moment everything changed. Callahan paused, set down his carving, and said, "The moment I chose not to look away." The journalist left with more than he came for. Not just a story, but a reminder that the West wasn't just about revolvers and revenge. It was about resilience, about rising from the dust with your dignity intact. The article would go on to be published in newspapers far beyond Red Mesa, and people everywhere would read about the man who broke no law except the one that said he should mind his own business, and the woman who rewrote what it meant to survive. When Callahan passed, the town stood still. No gun salutes, No marble stone. Just a quiet walk to the hill where he and Mara had watched the sun rise every spring. He was buried beneath a mesquite tree, his name carved by hand into the wood. Beside it, Mara planted wildflowers, the same kind left on their porch all those years ago. And as the wind moved through the valley, she whispered, "You're free now, old man, just like you made me." Then she stood, tall and steady, and walked back down the hill with the same fire in her heart he had once protected. Mara lived on for many seasons. She became a mother to the town, not through blood, but through presence. She was the woman people came to for wisdom, for comfort, for truth. And when the time came for her to return to the earth, the town gathered to sing, not a hymn, but a song she had written in her journal. A song about silence and chains and how freedom isn't always loud, but it's always felt. And so the story ends not with a shootout, nor a grave injustice avenged, but with something far rarer in the West: peace. Earned, guarded, and passed on. A man who refused to look away. A girl who refused to stay broken. And a love that taught an entire town that the greatest strength isn't in the draw of a gun, but in the stillness of a heart that chooses to stay when everyone else walks away. In a land once shaped by silence and blood, the story of Callahan and Mara echoes like the wind through canyon walls, quiet but unshakable. What began behind a saloon, in the darkness of chains and the shadows of cruelty, transformed into something the West rarely allowed: a second chance. Not just for survival, but for purpose. Callahan didn't rescue a girl. He stood for a truth no one else would. And Mara didn't stay broken. She rose, rebuilt herself, and became the kind of woman the West didn't know it needed. Their story reminds us that heroism isn't forged in gunfire or grand speeches. Sometimes it's in a choice made in the dark, a refusal to walk away, or the courage to stand still when the world demands you run. In a time when justice often came too late, or not at all, they prove that dignity doesn't ask for permission. It claims its place, quietly, through action. And when you strip away the dust and fire, what remains is this: two people who looked at each other and decided you were worth saving, again and again, until the saving became living. And isn't that what we're all searching for? A place where our pain has meaning. A partner who sees us not for where we've been, but for who we're still becoming. A home that isn't just walls and windows, but memory, effort, and earned peace. Callahan and Mara built that. Not because they were perfect, but because they were willing. Willing to bleed for something sacred. Willing to trust again, even when trust had once betrayed them. Their lives may be carved into the past, but the lesson they leave is timeless. No matter how dark the alley, no matter how loud the cruelty, there is always room for one person to stand up and say, "This ends here." And when they do, they don't just change one life. They change the land around them. Like roots splitting stone, like fire finding fuel in the cold, like love, real love, writing its name in a place where no one thought it could survive. If this story moved you, if it stirred something inside you, or reminded you of a time when you could have walked away but didn't, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel to hear more stories like this, where truth rides taller than legend. Like the video if you believe courage often begins in silence. And share in the comments. What would you have done the night Callahan found her?